Dear friends, I'm recording this message on Saturday, August 16th. The total chaos that we seem to be experiencing is about to be stopped, and then we'll see what is really going on. At this point, we're seeing the so-called EU leaders once again make total fools of themselves, this time with regards to the Alaskan summit between Putin and Trump. And many of us have a feeling that the cavalry is taking one step forward and two steps back. Well, there are two things that I believe we should keep in mind in view of this. One is, of course, that we are the cavalry, no one else is. And the other is that total chaos is usually what takes place when those who should be in control, in this case the monsters on the other side of the fence, have finally lost control. We will now see, I believe, if what we're seeing is some kind of elaborate, well-choreographed kabuki dance, a show, or if we're seeing the total breakdown of control. I personally believe we're seeing the latter, or maybe both, chaos and kabuki dance, but with the kabuki dance also collapsing and giving way to the monster's finally evident defeat. A defeat evident for everyone, not just for us. In truth, of course, they have been defeated for a long while now. But they're now leaderless and therefore lifeless puppets are still doing everything they can to keep up the appearance of being omnipotent and in control. How did I arrive at this conclusion? Well, up until right after the pandemic, the monsters had indeed, for a few years, been in control, quite obviously been in control, or almost in control. That's because they had full control over the mainstream media, the most important tool of their propaganda and mass psychological terrorism. They were only almost in control because even then, many people, and as we now know, many more people than the mainstream media let on, didn't believe their pandemic narrative. But in the meantime, that already large group of people whose intuitive immune system protected them from falling victim to the propaganda has grown massively. Anyway, as a result of this, a majority of the people do not trust the mainstream media anymore and are turning to the alternative media sources to find out what is really going on. Let me support these rather abstract thoughts by concrete evidence. What exactly do I mean by total chaos and kabuki dance? Well, the new German chancellor is already as much disliked or even despised as the old one. And this is according to the mainstream media, which I believe in a kind of a limited hangout maneuver had to report on this, and on the fact that this chancellor's party is now trailing in the polls behind the only real opposition party, AfD, by 2 full percentage points. The real figures are, as far as I'm concerned, much, much worse, both for their chancellor and for his, or rather their party. And that's why their controlled media came out with a tiny little bit of the truth, that's the so-called limited hangout, to hide the full extent of the disaster. Now, this chancellor, in cooperation with Keir Starmer from the UK and Emmanuel Macron, whom their own people in France and in Great Britain do not trust either, now these strange bedfellows are trying to tell Trump and Putin how they should conduct their negotiations. How can that be? Not even their own people take them seriously. And now they expect Trump and Putin to take them seriously? Well, and then we have those two wars, a real one in Ukraine and a much, much worse genocide that has been going on in Gaza since about the same time that I was kidnapped in Mexico. I realize that some people believe that Gaza is not real, but I am absolutely certain that it is. The suffering is real, and the killing. And that's because I was able to watch what was really going on in Gaza up until about a year ago on TRT, an English-language Turkish television station that was the only one that had reporters on the ground. And as I told you in some of my statements back then, they also had excellent interviews with very knowledgeable people, including Israelis, Jewish American investigative journalists, doctors from Canada, Norway, Australia, the UK, etc., etc. But then, about a little less than a year ago, they switched that station off for the prisoners in Rostov. That's where I was. Obviously, because they had heard from my statements that I made use of the information I got through that television station. This, by the way, is important to know. They, the monsters and their puppets, do listen to everything I say publicly, and maybe to more, but I don't care. Back to those two wars, or to be more precise, to the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza. What does it take to stop those wars? Only one thing: to stop military aid and assistance. That begs two questions. One, why does this not happen? And two, how come a majority of the people, especially in the so-called Western world, seem to be just sitting there and watching all this as though they were watching a movie? A movie rather than real immediate suffering of defenseless people in Gaza being bombarded, shelled, shot at, and starved. The first question, why is this not being stopped? The military aid and assistance needs to be answered by those who have the power to simply stop any and all military aid and assistance immediately, and that's the politicians whom we seem to have elected to their office. But the second question is one that we need to answer ourselves. Why are we pretending to ourselves, or seem to be pretending to ourselves, that this is just a movie and not real? Well, to answer this second question, I will refer to a letter from a German friend who sent me an excerpt that is a 3-page excerpt from John Coleman's book, The Tavistock Institute. I believe this is the same John Coleman who wrote The Committee of the 300. In this part of his book, John Coleman explains the so-called Lewin, L-E-W-I-N, Lewin doctrine, which he says is not easy for a layman to follow. I'll try to break it down for us so that it is easier to understand. The Tavistock Institute is based in the UK, but it has subsidiaries in many places in the world, for example, in Stanford, California. It has been in existence since the beginning of the 20th century. Some say that Hitler visited it either before the First World War or between the two wars. It is the largest brainwashing or MK Ultra institute in the world. Up until 1960 or so, their mind control techniques were based on the idea that if you have a what is called fixed personality, that is one that is susceptible to being predictably profiled or easy to read, and if you want to elicit from this personality a particular type of behavior, all you have to do is control the third variable of the equation, that is the environment, and thus produce the desired behavior in that person. You'll understand in a moment what this really means and how a slight rearrangement was enough to make us look first at Guantanamo Bay and then at Gaza as though we were watching a movie. At any rate, what I just described was the norm in social psychology formulas. The British MI6 uses it in almost every type of situation involving negotiations, army counterinsurgency operations, labor negotiations, diplomatic negotiations, used it up until apparently the 1960s. After 1960, however, Tavistock changed the equation by placing greater emphasis on the technique of the controlled environment, not the behavior, but the desired personality. What Lewin set out to accomplish, writes John Coleman, was far more drastic and permanent, altering the deeper structures of human personalities, not just their immediate behavior. In short, what Lewin succeeded in doing was to move behavior modification to identity change. Identity change was adopted by the nations of the world. Nations worked to acquire a new personality that would change the way the world looked at them. Here's how this works. Lewin observed that the inner self of the individual displays certain reactions when under tension from the environment. When there is no tension, then the normal self of the person is well differentiated, balanced, multifaceted, versatile. When a reasonable amount of tension is applied from the environment, then all the various abilities and faculties of the inner self go on alert, ready for effective action. But when an intolerable amount of tension is applied, then the geometry collapses into a blinded and undifferentiated soup, a primitive, a regressed personality. The person is reduced to an animal. The highly differentiated and versatile abilities disappear. The controlled environment takes over the personality. It is this technique that is used on captives held at the Guantanamo Bay prison camp in defiance of international law and the U.S. Constitution. The gross misconduct of the Bush administration at the camp is beyond the pale of normal Western Christian civilization, and its acceptance by a docile American public, Coleman continues, might be the first sign that the American people have been so changed by Tavistock's long-range penetration and inner direction conditioning, that's what it's called, long-range penetration and inner direction conditioning, that they're now ready to descend to the level of the New World Order in a one-world government where such barbaric treatment will be regarded as normal and accepted without protest. Let me jump in here. I don't think so. On the one hand, this long-range penetration and inner direction conditioning did not just work on the American people, but, as the example of Gaza shows, on pretty much everyone. But on the other hand, as again the example of Gaza shows, it didn't really work. People do protest what is happening in Gaza, and even more people will protest that once the full story, the whole truth, has been made visible for everyone to see. And by the way, the fact that even the German puppet government has now been forced to move and find harsh words for the Israeli puppet government is a really important case in point. Why? Because the German people have been exposed for the past 80 years, not just since the 1960s, but for the past 80 years since the war ended. Coleman continues, the fact that medical doctors took part in the inhuman torture of fellow human beings and felt no remorse would indicate just how far down the world has already fallen. This has been observed as being the basis for the military camp at Guantanamo, Cuba, which was opened there to avoid the strictures of the U.S. Constitution and to provide a Lewin-type controlled environment. The men being held at this psychological prison are now in the state of regression, where they have been reduced to the level of animals. Guantanamo is a type of camp that we predict, this is Coleman speaking, that we predict will be established all over the U.S. and the world when the New World Order / One World Government assumes total world control. It is sadistic, inhuman, beastly, designed to break the natural pride of the victims, to break the will to resist, and to reduce the prisoner to the level of beasts. During the First World Government experiment in the then USSR, men were allowed to use toilets only to be interrupted in the middle of evacuating and hustled out before they could clean themselves. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo were about at that level when the controllers were roughly subjected to worldwide scrutiny. See, that's what makes the difference. Get the truth out. And he continues, General Miller, who was the chief capo, has since disappeared from sight. Dissidents who insist on the U.S. government obeying the Constitution and demand their constitutional rights will, in future, be treated as dissidents, exactly like Stalin treated dissidents in the Soviet Union. Future Guantanamos that have sprung up all over America are a portent of the future. On that we can rely, writes John Coleman at the end of these 3 pages from his book, The Tavistock Institute on Human Relations, Shaping the Moral, Cultural, Political, and Economic Decline of the USA. And again, I beg to differ and state what we're seeing is the total collapse of the monster's control, including the collapse of their kabuki dance, if that is what they're performing. This is the chaos that comes from all the monster's alarm systems flashing red alert, you, the monsters, are dead monsters walking.